Hey, listeners, we're back. It's Tales of Abundance. I am Dr. John Oberg, and joining me as always, my co-host, Randy Lorensen. Randy, how are you today?
Doing great. How about you, John?
I can't complain. I'm excited about today's episode.
All right, me too. And we have a special guest today, Anthony Marino. One of our partners on this endeavor is in, and we're going to talk today about describing the four seasons. And just a little bit for the listeners, if they're not familiar with Anthony, Anthony has been a very successful business person, both in the corporate world and entrepreneur. We've got other episodes, we can dig a lot deeper into that, but somebody that has certainly lived this topic today and gone through these phases all the way from warrior to sage. John and myself, you're a little
four seasons of the career, right, Randy? Not the four seasons of like winter, fall, spring, and summer, but four seasons of the career is where we're headed today.
Yeah, life, career, correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
Love it.
And John and myself, you've heard more about our background as we've gone. But again, starting in the early parts of our career and cutting our sales in direct sales, to John getting his MBA, running companies, and now has a doctorate in clinical psychology and running a medical practice amongst other endeavors. So both of these gentlemen, I'll be asking most of the questions today. They'll be giving most of the answers, and both of them have just tons of wisdom around this area. So let's jump into it, John. What are these four seasons that you're talking about?
There's a lot of different people who talk about like the seasons of masculinity, the seasons of your career, the seasons of life. So there's lots of different models that are out there. And somebody once shared one with me that was warrior, prince, king, and sage. And I'm not saying this is like the right model. It was just one that at a moment in time, I was going through one of those transitions, and it helped me to understand what was changing in my career at that moment. And so I latched onto warrior, prince, king, sage, or warrior, princess, queen, sage could work just as well. And I think that while there are some things that are similar to the stages of masculinity that people talk about, there are some that are similar to other career stages. These just happen to be ones that grab me and that I've used to talk with about for clients over the years. I've talked to the two of you about these over the period of the years, and it was really not that someone has to be a warrior, or somebody has to be a prince or a king or a sage or a princess or a queen or a sage. What it really was identifying for people was that there's these stages in our career that people naturally progress through. It's not always linear, but generally it's directionally right. And it helps people to wrap their heads around what's happening during a transition of their career. I can walk you through what all those stages are, but that's it. It helped me to understand, oh, there's something happening here. This is a normal part of evolution and development of a career, and it's okay. And it helped me to understand what to look for, so I wasn't walking through potholes and off cliffs.
Yeah, and I found these to be helpful. I mean, these are something that you've brought to me over the years that we've worked together, and I have used them just yesterday, I think. One of the guys that, in my business that I work with on a weekly basis is struggling moving from the warrior phase to the prince phase. And we've been ongoing discussing this for a while. So I think it's a really interesting topic, and, different listeners will be at different places along this journey. So Anthony, again, you've got a lot of experience here, but can you give us some examples of when you were in the warrior phase, which is where we're starting? And why don't you have some stories about that?
Yeah, happy to do that. Thanks for having me here. I struggle with distinguishing between the phases. And what I mean by that is I feel like throughout my career, which has, that began as an entry-level person in a call center and progressed ultimately to owning my own business, 40 years later, that I always, as I kind of thought through this, I always feel like there's a bit of warrior in all the stages. But early on, specifically in those entry level and those early, corporate climbing careers, it was a violent feeling. I felt like, and rightly or wrongly, by the way, as I reflect on it, that I was a singular entity and I wasn't really aware, or did I take advantage of the rest of my army that might have been fighting this a similar battle? It seemed that early in our careers that we were lone warriors, that in fact, people on the team, whether it's in a call center environment or in an other management team environment, you were always kind of worried about the other person in the room. And it was a struggle. And the goal was to move up the next rung of the ladder. And it, unfortunately, during that early career, and I'm going to call it the first, 5 or 6 years of that career, I was singularly focused on getting to that next ladder, and I really didn't care. I wasn't aware of the damage to my relationships that was causing. So it was a singular focus. It was, move from the entry level position to a very low level, supervisory position where I might have been, quote unquote, managing 3 or 4 or 5 people. And then the next rung was, 10 to 15, and the next run was whatever. And during those, what you might categorize as those Prince stages, I don't ever feel like I felt like I was a prince. I always felt like I was in the warrior phase, even when I had accountability for other people.
So, Anthony, I probably should have done this at the beginning, but your background, again, later on, it was an executive with Toyota and Sears and some really high level positions before you become an entrepreneur. But you're talking now more in like you worked for a call center company. I forget the name of it, or I don't know if it matters. But you're talking about those days when you were working at the call center?
Yeah, I'm talking initially, yes. So even in that environment, I was there for 15 years. So I moved up into senior level positions during that time, purported senior level positions. But what I'm trying to get across is that even when I was a regional vice president and I had multiple locations and hundreds of people that, through other managers reported up through me, and I was accountable for an end result, I always felt I was in battle alone. I never felt like, well, I've got a team, I'm a prince, I'm just going to delegate to these folks. No, I'm not. As I said earlier, right or wrong.
Yeah, and there's probably some other issues in there that are outside the scope of like career development that we could maybe have a whole episode on that. I think what you're rightfully pointing out though is the warrior is the one learning the skills of war, right? And this is where I think the analogy works, is that like when you're the warrior, you learn the skills yourself, and then you learn how to use those skills with the person standing next to you. Those are stages of the warrior, if you use the analogy. And as the prince, what you start to do is you start to find leverage in your career by, it could be delegating and managing. It could be that you just learn how to operate in your career more effectively if you're in a career that doesn't include management. And then as you get to the king, kings still went to war. Sages still went to war. So there's still the skills of the warrior they had. They don't lose those skills. They just layered new skills on top of them. And I think that's the beauty of this career arc, is it points out that the differences of the job description of the warrior is different than the job description of the prince. The prince doesn't stop going to war. They just add to those skills to create more leverage and more impact, a broader scope. And then at the king, they're the top of the career. They may not run a company at the king stage of your career. They may not even manage people, but it's the peak of the career from a learning perspective, the peak of the career from a productivity perspective, maybe the peak of a career from an earnings perspective. And the sage then is a step back, and it's a give back phase, right? And so that's
let me jump in. And here's maybe you're articulating in a very philosophical way. And what I want to point out is, during the journey from warrior to the opportunity to be a prince, to the opportunity to be a king, and the opportunity to be a sage, there were times all during that corporate phase where one of my missions, along with, you know, hitting the numbers, if you will, at sometimes was taking down a peer. I was actually at war with a peer.
I think that, yeah, that I would say that happens sometimes. I'm not sure that happens as much today as it did in the 80s. I think 90s, you know, you're talking about
Right.
you're talking
Exactly.
about a moment in time that I don't think that has to be a part of someone's career arc. I think it is a part of some people's career arcs. But I think the thing that at least I would want a listener to leave with today would be that everyone goes through the career arc of warrior, prince, king, sage in some way. And you can call them whatever you want to call them, but you go through the part of skill development. And once you have skill development, then you have leveraging to a larger opportunity and larger influence. And then you move into the peak part of your career. And then you have the opportunity to give back. And I think understanding that framework is useful for anybody in any career, whether that's a professional career, a non-professional career. I think I've never thought about it in terms of parenting, but my guess is there's a similar arc with parenting if you think about parenting and grandparenting. But I think there's a natural flow here, and so I think there's lots of people who went through what you're talking about, where there is a very zero-sum game in a corporate environment. It's eat or be eaten. But I think that's a part of the society. I don't think everyone experiences that. I think everyone experiences the fact that they have this maturation in the work they do, whether that's professional work or not professional work. There's a set of seasons.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with anything you said. I certainly that, you know, the corporate environment in quote unquote in those days, I'm really aging myself, was I'm sure different than what it is today. You know, we live with very little technology and so on. But I would say this, that in my observations of people I'm close to, if it's not about battling a peer, it is about creating a shield around the role that they are in so that they are protected. They may not be lashing out as we did back in the day, but they're also, as warriors, building a shield around their roles so that they're protected from internal changes or external environmental things that could affect their roles. So,
And I think you would agree that some of those shields are really healthy and helpful, and some of those shields are really not very healthy and
right.
maybe counterproductive to the person and or the company they work for. We've both seen that.
Totally. I totally
So,
agree.
Anthony, I think it's important that different people go through this at different paces, right? And we have different backgrounds, and some people go very quickly through some stages, very slowly through others, bounce back and forth. I know in my career, I've bounced back and forth. I've moved up and then went back to the warrior and started over. For the listeners, so the warrior phase was kind of natural to you, and I think I have another follow-up question about why that is, but what were the skills that you started to develop, and what were the mental changes that helped you start moving from warrior to prince?
Well, it starts with results, right? I mean, you have it's throw the touchdown passes, you know, achieve the objectives that were assigned to you. Develop. I thought, and as I think back, developing maturity and a personality that fit with what the upper management team was looking for. Having a little bit of fun along the way, and then assembling, you know, like-minded people to join the fray, which resulted in, you know, becoming a natural leader of people. It was clear that getting chosen for leadership positions was going to happen, and it did happen at a very, very rapid pace early in my career.
So, Anthony, I get the feeling, I didn't know, I've known you for quite a while, but I didn't know you back then. I get the feeling that you were selected to be a leader, or the prince role as we're calling it right now, before you were ready to make that jump.
Oh, without question, I was thrust into roles that I wasn't prepared for, and I'm not sure anybody really is. No one's 100%, but I was certainly less than half full in terms of my capabilities to take on the level of responsibility that I was given.
So
That's
what,
okay. But that's okay when you're growing, right? Like
Yeah.
no one's ready to run, the 6th mile after the 4th mile, but that's how you stretch your muscles. That's how you grow, right? And,
Yeah.
and I think it's really important. Marcus Buckingham wrote this great book called First Break All the Rules. And one of the things he talks about in that book is that there's a leadership and management path in companies, but sometimes there's not a technical development path for an individual contributor. And so I would hate for a listener who's an individual contributor to hear that the only way to grow through these 4 seasons is through a management or a leadership arc. That happens to be your arc. It also happens to be the arc that I went through. It happens to be the arc Randy went through. But that's happenstance. There are lots and lots of people who aren't in management or leadership positions that go through this same arc, and they go through it as an individual, and this arc exists. And so, but we don't always see it coming, and we're not always ready. And I go back to 2017, Anthony, a conversation you and I started in late 2016 about what happens when you retire. And we both knew you were 8 or 10 years away from that. You remember that?
Sure, I do.
And so do you remember how negatively you reacted to that?
I do. I do remember.
So you're clearly a lifelong learner. So what were the things you were learning, skills you were developing that helped you move at that point in your life?
Well, a key element was soliciting mentorship from people that I had a lot of respect for, both peers and call them bosses, or other people in the organizations that I could look up to and get counsel from. I really felt like, 'cause I was constantly getting guidance on, what I should be doing and shouldn't be doing. Early on in my career, I'll tell you, but it wasn't a funny story at the time, but I think 6 or 7 years into my lower middle management role. I think I was managing about 20, 25 people in Atlanta, Georgia. And I had a boss. My boss's boss was doing our annual reviews. And he was a old school Southern gentleman, smoked cigars, 6'7", very intimidating. And I will never forget, he was sitting at my boss's desk in his office with his feet up on the desk, smoking a cigar. And I had just finished a year. I never missed a goal. I had won a trip to Hawaii. I was just like, I was the cock of the walk in the operation. And he looked at me and he said, Marino, if you were the last manager on earth, I wouldn't work for you. And I'm giving you $100 raise. And I was just devastated by that. First of all, the raise was actually a pretty good raise, but in those days, we got into a conversation as to why. And he was very honest. He said, you're just too tough on people. You don't appreciate the people around you. You're getting all kinds of results, but you can't manage people if you kill them. And that, his name was Pete, and that sets a foundation for me. And I never forgot it. Obviously, it's almost 40 years later. And that set me on a path of starting to look at life and management through the eyes of the people that work with me. And that was a big change for me, because I always viewed them as working for me, go dig the ditch, deeper and faster, as opposed to being more supportive and understanding where they're coming from and respecting the fact that they have children that have to get to daycare, and all of those things were I was blind to, or uncaring of early on. So once that started, that kind of shift in the earth beneath me, I was able to start to build on that slowly. It was a long journey, but it was a very key moment in my career.
I think for listeners, I mean, there's, John and I know you well enough to know where that came from, right? Like you grew up in, rough streets of Boston. I mean, we could spend hours on that. I don't think we want to do that now, but do you want to just give listeners an idea of kind of that foundation or that core and some of the first jobs, if you call them jobs, that you had?
I don't think it's really unique. I think a lot of people grow up in, a working class family with working class friends and, their dads, mostly dads at that time, and more, the old school traditional households. And it was, everything was a battle. So, early on, I worked for, the city, not the city, the town of Winthrop, making $2 an hour in the summers, painting chain link fences. And, most of that money went back into the family. And, so it was a very, a very typical of the, the 70s. And if you recall people who recall the 70s, it was a very difficult time, during inflation. We're coming out of a war. It was not, a bed of roses for a vast majority of people at that time. So it gave me a foundation of fear, where, I knew I had to do what I needed to do to survive, that I wasn't going to get a handout from a trust fund or anything like that. And none of my friends got those things either. So we're all kind of in that same boat. And we went off to do working man type roles. And I think it's very normal. And frankly, I think it was a great foundation to build off of.
Great. John, let's transition into the Prince phase. And we've been bouncing back and forth as many people do throughout their careers. What are some of the skill sets and changes that typically happen in a person when they move from warrior to Prince as they make that transition?
I think the Prince is more about broader influence, right? And so broader influence for an individual contributor can mean that your work as an individual contributor influences more people because you have more visibility, you have more exposure. Like that's one way that someone might transition to that second phase. Another way might be moving into leadership or management as a supervisor, a manager. And so it's sometimes it's different skill sets professionally. Sometimes it's more of the same. Sometimes it's a skill set of, influence as an individual contributor. Sometimes it's as a, I think about someone who, might be a stay-at-home dad or a stay-at-home mom who volunteering becomes a part of their transition into that next stage where they're just giving back their time and talent in an early part of their career. So I think that's, the warrior is about the building of the individual skills and getting, formed in that early part of your career. And then the second stage, the Prince, is really about extension into broader reach and finding ways to use leverage, and whether that's through learning, whether that's through managing, whether that's through influence. I think there's a number of ways to do that. But I think the important point that we haven't talked about is the danger of someone who wants to skip warrior to go straight to Prince, or skip warrior and Prince and go straight to king. Like then you just don't have the underpinnings that hold you up when you get into being ready for those later stages. And so again, not linear, right? People can go backwards in their career and restart skills and jobs, but this is really about just the transitions. It's about knowing, and I think that if you can help people see transitions coming, it's helpful, for some more than others. But it's like having a tour guide and knowing where the turns are coming. I think it can make for a smoother, not smooth always, but a smoother transition if you know that something's coming, and you can get prepared to a certain extent. But to Anthony's point, I don't think anyone's ever fully prepared for any of these transitions.
I think that's great, right? If we're really growing and in search of abundance, we're challenging ourselves and probably taking on a role that we're not yet ready for, right? Like I know for me, growing up where we had more time than money and you didn't hire, you didn't delegate, that just wasn't part of the culture I grew up around. For me, that was the big challenge even though I was a manager and I was in charge of other people, I didn't have that skill set, but even more so, I hadn't developed that belief system that they could do it and that trust that other people could handle it. Was a big challenge for me that took me a while to get over. But why don't you give us an example, John, of your Prince phase? and what you did there. Tell us a story about that.
I think for me, it was when I started to have large leadership roles where I started to manage, dozens or hundreds of people, that was an extension. I wasn't in charge of the company. I wasn't a CEO, but I started to have real responsibilities for, large numbers of people, by some standards. And, the decisions and the choices that I was making impacted more than just me. Now my decisions were impacting other people. And the work that I was doing had a broader impact on those people, positively and negatively throughout the process. Interestingly enough, I had a conversation with one of my boss's bosses, where I was on a phone call. I'll never forget where I was standing, and I was told that if I didn't change my leadership, that I was capped out in my career and I would never go any further than I was. And I was managing hundreds of people. So similar to Anthony's conversation, I never put those two stories together, even though I've heard his story before. I was devastated and didn't believe my manager because I was also breaking, records, and I was, a golden boy in the company and upward, promotions and all these things. But he saw something that I didn't see, and I didn't believe it for 6 months, but it really resonated with me. And after 6 months, I called him back and said, "How do I fix it?" And he said, "I don't know." And it ended up I did find some solutions to the problem through mentorship and guidance and other people. And he and I are still good friends today. We still talk. And, so 20 years after that conversation, I said, I've never really talked to you, but saying you didn't know how to fix it, it really sucked and it hurt. And it wasn't unfair because you didn't know, but I wish you'd tried harder to know." And he said, "I've reflected back on that too. And I wish I would have too." And so it was a real moment for us to kind of look back at that moment where I was a prince, but there's a whole evolution of being princely, from not very effective prince to getting ready for king in the career. And that was a real moment of an inflection point for me in my career.
Yeah, I learned that there was a big difference between going to battle with your team versus directing every single thing that they were doing and critiquing every single thing that they were doing before they did it, while they were doing it, and after they did it. And it took a lot to learn how to give them authority to do what they felt was right.
I think Gladiator, that movie with Russell Crowe, was a real interesting depiction of, leadership and loyalty and honor and all the things they talk about in that movie. It was a really great depiction of why people, invest in their leaders when a leader leads from the front. So, and I think you learn that as a warrior because you want that leadership from the front, whatever your venue is. And, I don't know if I love, as we talk this through, I don't know if I love the warrior part in the sense that it tells people you're always at battle. And I think everybody always has a battle going on. Everyone's got tough days. Everyone's got their stuff going on. So from that perspective, I think that's right. I don't think everything has to be zero sum. That's not my belief system today.
John, don't you think the battle though can just be with yourself getting better, with the work, with the next? I mean, isn't that the way that ideally? I don't know that that's the way most people approach it. It's not the way we're talking about it, but isn't that ideally the way to approach it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I don't know that I've considered the answer long enough to have I can give you an off the cuff answer, but my off the cuff answer is I think so. I think it's, that I'm the person that gets in my way more than anybody else in the world. That's for sure. Nobody else has gotten in my way more than me in my life.
I was never in the corporate setting in the same way that Anthony was. And I never, even when it was there, I was probably naive, not probably, I was naive and unaware of some of the competition. So I just kind of put my head down and went with it. But I never felt that I was in those battles, even if I was.
Yeah, and I think that's fine. I think, the purpose of this is not to get people fighting with each other. The purpose of this framework is to give people language around transitions so that when someone doesn't understand what's coming or what's happening to them, they can look at it and say, "Oh, well, this is actually this is a part of being mature. This is a part of growing through something. And, whether it's this model or a different framework, I'm not hung up on that. I don't care which framework someone uses. I just think it's useful for someone to know that changes occur, that here's broadly what those changes look like. And here's some ways you can get prepared for it. And you're never fully prepared, and that's okay. And that you're not alone, and that there are people that can help you as mentors, that if you're willing to mentor people along the way, you don't have to be a sage to be a mentor. You can mentor someone 10 years behind you when you're a warrior prince, and so I think that's just, when we problem solve, sometimes we start from the beginning and we have to build the problem up from like scratch. And I find that if you find that other people have already solved the problem and you can grab onto that, this is just one way of seeing where other people have solved some of these problems and not having to learn the hard lessons all on your own. I think that's the real value in this framework.
Now that we think about it, I think this is one of the things that probably through good luck more than anything I got right, is that when I was in the warrior phase, it was more a battle with me, the self, reading the right books to go to the next level, figure things out. And that's, by the way, the mindset that I've thought about it. It's interesting. You guys think about it in a little bit of a different way, which is okay. But I thought about it with, this is the skill set I need to develop. I need to go to this seminar, or I need to work on the skill, or I need to record what I'm doing and improve it, whatever it happened to be, I think is.
Maybe that's luck, Randy. I think knowing your background, it also might be just the way you were raised, in terms of, you come from kind of what I would call a prototypical or stereotypical Midwestern farm town with a farm background and a farm work ethic, and you meet a lot of those stereotypes. And so I think that wouldn't, again, I'm not making like you called me a clinical psychologist earlier. I'm not a clinical psychologist yet. I'm in the process of getting all that licensure. So thank you for giving it to me before the state does. But
No problem.
But I think that if you drew some of those threads out, maybe some of it was luck, maybe some of it was the environment that your parents raised you in, and everyone's got a different background. I don't know. I don't know how important that is. I think it might be interesting to understand that, but someone said to me once, they said feedback is such a tough word. Feed forward is maybe more helpful. And I knew what they were saying, which was you want to take information to see how it can be useful in moving yourself forward, versus looking back with, too much staring at the belly button is sometimes not helpful.
Well, let's move with that. Let's move to the king stage.
Oh, I want to hear what Anthony had to say. What were you jumping in there?
Well, no, a couple things. One thing was that during the learning process of being a prince, one of the key mistakes that I made was thinking everybody on my team had the same motivations that I had, that everyone on that team wanted to become a prince, wanted to manage a team, wanted to grow. And we early on, I almost looked upon those people with disdain who were happy in their quote unquote, their warrior phase, working 40 hours a week, going home at 5 o'clock, having a family life and work-life balance, while I was working 80 hours a week, and I was never in the off position. So that was a key learning thing that as I progressed, I got actually pretty good at. And it taught me to leverage the specific skills people had versus dragging them through the mud to something that they weren't necessarily interested in. And I wouldn't call it the understanding the Peter principle. It's more about understanding their individual desires at that moment in time. So I thought that was really an important piece of being in that Prince phase.
Oh, by the way, they might have been in the Prince phase by volunteering at their church or giving to their family. Like, in other words, they might have looked like a warrior to you, but they were really a prince in their overall vocation. I shared with a friend of mine yesterday, like one of my biggest fears in life that I did not have early in my career is like, it's, I'm a faithful guy. It's like, I don't want to take somebody off of God's path because I have a different path for them. Like that actually frightens me. And so, but I didn't, early in my career, I wanted everybody on my path. That was, that wasn't helpful or healthy at all.
Exactly.
I think that's a great insight, though. I still struggle with that. I like you, Anthony, I've gotten better at it, but I still struggle. We just think that people want the same things we want, or they have the same goals, and the same belief systems, etc., right? And clearly they don't, but I think it's a great
Let's have a whole episode later on about acceptance. I think that's such an important topic that we should delve into. I can only say that because I might have been the worst in the world at it at one point in my life. Like, I'm not sure there's anybody that was worse at that than me. And now I think I can spell the word. I'm not sure I'm good at it, but I can understand how bad I was at the very least.
All right. Let's move to King. John,
Yeah,
tell us about the King phase.
King is about the peak of the career, right? It's about the part where you're probably having the most impact in terms of broad impact. You probably are at the peak of the skill set, peak of learning. You might be at the peak of your income gain. And so this is, generally people experience this in their early to late 50s and early 60s. And for me, I didn't know what I was aspiring to early in my career, but I thought I was aspiring to be a king very young. And so a lot of people think that because they're the CEO of a company, they're the king. And that's not necessarily the case. Like, you don't have to be the CEO to be the king. And just because you are the CEO doesn't make you one. This is really just about the apex of the third season, right? And growing into the maximum, I'm sure maximal is even a word, maximum productivity. And I don't mean productivity necessarily professionally. Like, I think there's people that, stay-at-home mom, stay-at-home dad that are, have maximum achievement at this part of their career as they're then getting ready to transition into the sage piece of this. And I love talking about this one right in this moment, because Anthony, I would say that you've just kind of hit the apex of the transition between king and sage in your transition. I mean, just in the last less than 12 months.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, there were so many elements of so many characteristics of the warrior phase and the prince phase that I dragged along into the king phase. And yes, having a lot of maturity, having been in battle, winning and losing. So many of those battles gives you a hardened look at things, and the development that I had by the time I reached the opportunity to be in this phase served me well. And I think we were, along with help and support from a lot of people, I was able to navigate this phase pretty well, not without mistakes and problems along the way, but by and large, it was a very successful time for me.
It didn't feel like that every day along the way, though, right? I mean,
no. It didn't feel that way all along the way. It wasn't until I started to transition to the next phase that I got a chance to look back. And I think that's something that we can't ignore, that the time that I grew up in, one of the things that was never taught to us was reflection. While in that phase, it was always what's on my to-do list for today, what's going to be on my to-do list for tomorrow. And I never really had the skill to stop and reflect and enjoy and, express my appreciation to others as much as I should have. I mean, as I went along, I got better at it, but it was still commanding an army, as a king and assessing things. So, yeah.
Oscar Wilde said something about like moderation in all things, especially moderation.
Yep.
So, yeah.
I think both of you have straddled the king and the sage for a while. I mean, Anthony, you're making the transition more to the sage, but you've always had wisdom, right? And for those listening, the three of us are a part of a group that gets together once a month, and basically sit around and try and make each other smarter. But you've always had wisdom and insight, and so part of that sage, even when you're in the king, I think it's just you're making a more full-fledged and actively seeking mentorship now.
Right.
Might be the big change, right? Is that
Yeah.
accurate?
Yep, absolutely.
And John, certainly you are running, your organization. I mean, you've got all this stuff going on, and you have been coaching and in the sage. I mean, I think even more so, you've been straddling the two. I mean, do you
Yeah, I don't
want
know.
to talk about that, or do you not agree with that?
I don't think I'm at the sage part yet. I think the sage is the give back part of your life where you have generally more time. You've got some experiences that I don't have yet. And I appreciate you saying that, like, I'm trying to give people guidance and I'm counseling them. And that's true that I am. I think there's lots of people that have counseling as a part of their vocation, but that's a little different than the sage part of this model, right? And again, this is just a set of words, right? We talk about warrior, prince, king, sage. That's just a set of words talking about the different seasons. So I definitely don't feel like I've been in the fourth season yet. I don't think I'm going to be there for the next 10 years. I am preparing for what's going to happen in those 10 years and how I want to enter that phase. I think I have the unique either desire or sickness, depending the way you look at it, to kind of stay ahead of those types of things. And so I've got a 50-year plan about, what things I want to do to live my life. And it's not like a meticulous day by day, minute by minute plan, but I do know that, like, when I get to Sage, I want to be able to have a clinical therapeutic background so that I can provide therapeutic services that I don't provide today. And so I'm actually getting my clinical license right now so that I can do that 10 or 15 years from now. And I'll do it along the way so I can build up the wisdom I need to do that well. But I plan to do that on a part-time basis where I can, really lean into the sage. And
Okay.
so, yeah. Anthony, do you remember the conversation we had about that? It would have been 7 years ago. Do you remember that in 2016, 17, where we talked about, like, what Sage was going to look like and getting ready for the transition? And I think you poo-pooed it for the first 4 or 5 years, but in the last 12 months before it happened, I started pushing pretty hard on that for you. And
Well,
I'd love to.
yeah, I do remember the conversation, but I also remember that it was a turbulent time where we were getting prepared for it. We would talk about it because we had transactions on the table, one of which got, to the 23rd hour, and then the rug was pulled out from under us. So I would get in the zone, and then I would have to revert myself back to, running a business. So, almost every time you would raise it, I would poo-poo it even more because I was so skeptical about successfully navigating a transition. But I did think about it a lot, and I'm still, as you said, it's a transition. It's not a destination. So I'm still working through that.
Yeah. It's
Maybe we could give the listeners just an idea of what jobs, and certainly this is not a hard and fast rule, but I would say for myself, like in the warrior phase, it started out really young, picking rocks in farmers' fields and doing farm work and then washing dishes and, eventually into sales and along the way. What other jobs might people do during the warrior phase?
I don't
Like,
know.
what would be common jobs?
I had to really think about that, Randy. I think the jobs themselves, I wouldn't say like some jobs are warrior and some jobs aren't, because I think it gives people the misimpression that if I want to skip the warrior, I can skip those jobs and go to the next one. And so I think it's more about where one is in their own development, right? Where they are in their own, and I think there's a development of skill sets. I think there's a development of someone's mindset and just how they view and see the world. I think there's emotional maturity that comes along the way with time. And, the human brain isn't even fully formed until your mid-20s, in terms of just the biology of the brain being formed in many cases. And then I think there's, yeah. And so I don't think it's about the job itself, which is a pretty common misconception. And based on the fact that I chose 4 jobs, warrior, prince, king, and sage, that actually maybe that's a horrible way to create a framework. Maybe we should rethink about like, season 1, season 2, season 3, season 4 might be easier for people to grasp. So I would really encourage people not to think about the job itself, and to think about like the professional development of the skill, and of the way you see the world, and of the emotional maturity. That's the way I would think people should look at it.
Yeah.
By the way, not to throw a wrench into things, but why not? There's even a phase that we're just waving over, and that's when you talk about jobs, there are careers people embark on that don't require you to be a warrior, that don't, they're working class jobs, and people are absolutely happy and content and satisfied to be in those roles where they're just performing a function.
Yeah, but Anthony, I think that misses though. I think that misses, and so I think that I'm really glad you said that, because I think that misses the point of the seasons. In season 1 of that working class job, they're learning the journeyman, the basics, like how to do the most fundamental things. And then as a prince, what they're doing is they're learning how to be efficient and effective, and problem solve more effectively, and get through more tickets in a day. And then as a king, they might be bringing a journeyman along. They might be then a part of a 2-man team that's out there, and they're helping that next generation create leverage for an organization. And as a sage, they might be retired and sitting on the porch and passing that wisdom on to their family, their friends, their community. And so I don't think there are jobs that don't go through this. It just looks different than the careers the 3 of us had. And we keep putting it back into like how we walked through it. But I think that's short-sighted. I think you have to look at this as, what would happen if somebody did have a trust fund and never had to work a day in their life? I still think they go through these phases of maturation successfully or unsuccessfully. I think that if you live in any part of the world, you go through these phases successfully or unsuccessfully. And there have been times in history where people didn't live to be a sage because the world was a violent place, or was a sick place, or was a whatever, and life expectancy was short. But I really wouldn't want someone to hear this and think, oh gosh, this doesn't apply to me, because it really does apply to any career, regardless of whether it's, like I said, a paying career or non-paying career. These are phases people go through from a development perspective.
I think of the warrior phase more as sharpening skills, right? And instead of maybe working on sword skills or horse skills or archery skills, it's what are the skills I need for this job, right? What is it that I have to practice? What books do I need to read? What mentors do I need to learn from to get me to the next phase? Is kind of the way I think about it, I guess.
Yeah, that's fair.
So, and I've had to go back to the warrior phase a few times, right? Like, I mean, there are times where I think, I moved and had to go back and start over on a different path.
Yeah.
Well, let's transition. Let's talk about that path. Let's talk about identifying a path, John. I know you got 4 questions that we've talked about before, and you want to go forward with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think as long, and this, I think this comes back to like the sage phase, right? I think when you're in the sage phase, you can look back at your path and recognize how you got to your path and how you got there. And so, the sage phase is a place of sharing that wisdom back through the generations, if you will. And so I think the 4 questions are a way of maybe grabbing the lens of the sage for your own career, and then trying to kind of just get a view for what that might be by looking what it might look like looking backwards. So in other words, if I looked at the end of my life and said, okay, at age 80, what path do I wish I would have gone on? That would be a way to think about my path. These 4 questions are just a different way to think about the path. And there are lots of models and lots of people who have different questions. There's a great article by Laura Nash called Success That Lasts that comes at these questions that I thought was really impactful. But there's also this, centuries old idea of a reason for being in Japan, Ikigai, that talks about what you love and what the world needs and what you can be paid for and what you're good at. And so that's one way of looking at this. The thing that I found to be most successful is I thought about the future would be like, what am I really good at? What am I really passionate about? how do I want to spend my time, talent, and treasure? And then how do I want to leave my mark on the world? And as I looked at the middle of that Venn diagram, it kind of helped me understand my purpose, my calling, my being. I think the Japanese ikigai, and I'm not even sure I'm saying that right, ikigai, that is another way of doing it that's really successful. I think Laura Nash has a way of doing it, but the thought that you reflect regularly on the skill set you have, the passions you have, how you're going to spend all of those things and the impact that you want to have. And then, of course, what the world will pay you for, that will tell you what path you want to be on. Right. And for me, it's told me what path I was built for. Right. And, so I used to subscribe to this thought that you can be anything you want to be. And I love the romantic notion of you can be anything you want to be. But the truth is, if I want to be the starting center for the Los Angeles Lakers and I'm not 7'1", I'm 5'10", it's true that I could play professional basketball, perhaps. Well, if you shoot me shoot a basketball, it's not actually possible for me personally. But I can't be 7'1". I can't will myself into that. So I think just being, for me, honest about what are there limitations, but then how do I make sure I don't create false limitations? A lot of us create really false limitations. There's a great book written about weightlifters in the 1980s in Eastern Europe. They were accused of using doping, but they were also really effective at using mindset control to help people have their maximum potential. And some weightlifting coaches in the US went over to train with them. And the weightlifting coaches that went over there lifted some of their personal bests of their entire life without being in their top physical condition, based on the mindset work that was done in those sessions, in that one short visit they had with Eastern European weightlifting coaches. And so I think the Ikigai done correctly, the 4 questions that I have done correctly, the questions Laura Nash done correctly, they try to remove any self-limiting beliefs, and they help you to see the world of possibilities. And I think this is best done with your friends or a mentor. Like, my friends sat down and explained to me what they thought I was great at, and they told me what what I was passionate about from their perspective, and how they heard me talking about how I want to spend my life and the impacts that I want to make. And they were generous enough to also tell me what they thought my shortcomings were. That wasn't part of my 4 questions, but they also shared those things with me.
Should we do that exercise now? Shall Anthony and I tell you what your shortcomings are?
I mean, is this a 6-hour episode? I think you probably have a pretty long list.
So let's go somebody. So that was all high level. Let's get more granular with this. All right, let's dig down. Somebody's listening and they want to figure out these 4 questions or figure out their path. Okay. What do they do? What's the first step?
I mean, we give people a piece of paper, and the first, it's like we fold the paper into four quadrants. And then, on one list, we say, okay, what are you skilled at? What are you good at? Whether it's a natural talent or a learned skill, doesn't matter. Just write down everything you're good at, and across all 5 facets of your life. Write down what you're good at in terms of your mind, body, and spiritual fitness. Write down what you're good at in terms of your family, and write down what you're good at in terms of your friends and your community. Write down what you're good at financially and professionally. Write down what you're good at when you're having fun. Like if you're great at playing video games, it should go on the list. And so write it all down. And then when you're done with that question, write down everything you're passionate about. Not with a justification, not with why. Anything you're passionate about, just put it on the list. Then next, write down the lifestyle you want to have. And again, think of all the 5 F's that we talk about, your fitness, mind, body, spirit. Think about your family, think about your friends and community, think about how you want to have fun, think about financial and professional goals that you have. And then how do you want to spend your time, your energy, your money, right? And do those things all resolve? Because if I don't want to work at all and I don't have money and I want to spend a lot of it, that doesn't resolve, right? Or what I see as frequently is people say they want to make a huge amount of money, but they don't want to spend that amount of money. And so I often ask the question, if you made less money, so you had enough to spend and enough to save, but no more than that, what would you do with the extra time? And would that reduce the stress in your life? The number of people that I've sent to a financial planner to reduce the stress in their life because they figured out wow, I'm actually doing better off than I think I am, happens all the time. And then the 4th question is, what's the impact I want to make in my life? And this is usually the hardest question. And so the way that I encourage people to do this is just to write down their obituary. like write down what you want someone to say about your spiritual, mental, and, like your mind, body, and spirit, that part of your life. Write down what you want someone to say about how you treated your family. Write down what you want someone to say about how you were with your friends and with your community. Write down what you would want someone to say at your funeral about how you had fun, and then about, how you did professionally. And using that frame, which by the way is the same framework I used for my mom's obituary. And I've had lots of people talk about what a beautiful story that I told about her life. And I didn't like say, here's the 5 Fs. But when I was writing her obituary, I thought about all the facets of her life and I wove them into a tapestry of her story. And I thought, if someone was going to do that story for me, what would that story be? And I've written that story down, and then I look at it once a year and just say, is it all still true? And I don't think just because you write it down, you have to commit to it. It's just an exercise. And so I think it's a really powerful exercise for people to go through, and it's vulnerable. It can be difficult and it can be uncomfortable. So we do have a tool on our website where you can have those 4 questions, and you can have some like thoughts about how to kind of go deeper into those 4 questions at talesofabundance.com. So feel free to download this tool, which is really just a set of the questions and some prompts that'll help you answer some of these questions.
And either of you, so somebody's done those 4 questions and they're likely early in their career or mid-career, or some people are looking to switch careers. What advice would you give to those people in finding success and trying on careers and just kind of figuring out the path forward?
Anthony, you want to take that one first? You want me to do it?
I don't think I understand where he's coming from on this. Go ahead. So if you want to start, maybe repeat that, Randy, a little bit. You kind of lost me a little.
I can say it back to you, Randy. You're asking if someone's done this and they don't know what to do with it, what would you tell them to do?
Yeah, or just if somebody, I think there's a lot of people listening, they don't know what they want to do with their lives, right?
Yeah.
It could be somebody in college and they have a major, but they don't know. I mean, that was certainly me. Or they're working a job and they don't know if they want to stay there, or should they transition, or they're unhappy. I mean, there could be 100 different reasons, right? What advice? I mean, what would you tell them to do?
Well, first, go ahead, John. No, I was going to give an example, a very recent example. Now I clearly see where Randy's coming from. I mean, I'm a volunteer mentor to people that are in the first phase of starting a business, or they've got a business that's moving and they need help to scale it and grow it. And yesterday I had a conversation with a chemical engineer from Texas Tech who wants to start a business. Now she's 3.5 years into her undergraduate degree in chemical engineering, and she wants to start a marketing company. I'm not sure she could move herself 180 degrees from her previous path. And so the whole discussion, as John outlined, was, okay, let's answer some, you're going to need to spend some time, and we'll get back together in a couple of weeks. But, why did you choose electrical engineering? What was your chemical engineering? What was your drive then? What were you chasing? What were you just good at it and you just decided to keep going? Is it a passion of yours? And then the same questions for marketing. Why all of a sudden are you willing to toss all the effort that you put into something to move into a field that you only have very narrow skills in? And so she's going to have to go through this process to be sure this is something that she wants to move forward with. So it's very, very timely in the sense of sorting out what do I want to put my energy behind and why.
Well, and the from to is important, right? Like I think a lot of people are moving away from something and they go towards something they think seems to be easier or the answer or whatever. And I think that's where I've had this type of conversation with people all the time. It's like they think the grass greener over there because they don't know enough about that garden. And, I don't know if Confucius really said it or not, but they say the man who thinks the grass is greener on the other side of the fence needs to become a better gardener. And I think there's a lot of that happens in the world. People, and they start running from one thing to the next because the next thing looks easier, faster, cheaper, better, whatever. And this exercise is about stopping that process. It's about really stopping and saying, and taking an inventory and saying, what am I built for? And then embracing that. And then the whole idea of the 4 seasons we talked about earlier was embracing the work that goes along that. Like there's no avoiding that. And so, but I do see people who change and move from one to the other as a coping mechanism of some kind. And
Right.
I don't encourage people to do that if they're running away from something. Like I don't think that gets people to the place they want to be. And so if I had a conversation with the young woman that you're talking about, I would have them go through the 4 questions. And then I would ask them, what is it that draws them to marketing? And I would match up against their skills and their passions and how they want to spend their day to day. And in most of the cases where I've done that before, what they think the day to day is for marketing isn't what the actual job that has to get done is. And they don't actually want to do that either. And then we have a real conversation about what do you want to do or what don't you do? And, they're like, for me, I got really clear about the environment that I wanted to work in. I got really clear about the industry that I wanted to work in. I got, but I didn't know any of those things in my 20s. And so while all of that's true, the other encouragement I would give to people, particularly early in their career, is you don't have to know where you end up. Like my 50-year plan doesn't say in 50 years, here's where I'm going to be. It says in 50 years, directionally, I want to help people. And so for the next couple of years, what I want to work on is this. And so I think it's directional, not, and by the way, had you asked me where I was going to be when I was 51 at 20 or 30, my answer would have been 100% wrong. And I'm fairly sure that that's true for lots of people. There are some people that get into a career as a doctor or maybe as a lawyer, and they do that for 30 or 40 years. I've met those people. They're wonderfully talented and fortunate. I've also met doctors who have left medicine. I've met lawyers who have left law. And so I think sometimes we hold out an ideal or a norm when people are younger in their career. And so my encouragement would be to let that go and not to hold on to that picture perfect marketing piece. But to really investigate what they're built for in their own unique way, and then walk a path that probably someone's walked some of before them.
Not to step on Randy's questions, but John and Randy, how much of your decision making, or using this young lady as an example, how much of her or similar people's decision making is influenced by making a living, and the pressure of making a living at such an early age? I think in her case, and maybe others, it colors their decision making to the point where, she had a couple of clients that asked her to do some social media for her, and she got intoxicated by getting a paycheck, and suddenly she's ready to abandon what had to be a brutal existence to become a chemical engineer. And it just struck me so hard that her desire to make a living washed away so much of what she had already worked on. And I think maybe I'm asking the question, do you think there's a greater influence here than maybe what might have existed in the past?
I have a little different take on this maybe than the two of you. You two tend to approach it from a practical standpoint, and I don't want to belittle that because I think it's important, right? Like they have to be practical. People have got to be able to make a living. And I agree with everything you said, that a lot of people switch thinking the grass is going to be greener. And I would also argue that if it's really, and then the questions that you brought up, John, figuring out if it really is the path she wants to be on are important. But I think we have to be really careful in our rush for practicality to not crush people's dreams, right?
Oh,
I mean, and most of...
But Randy, that's not at odds at all with what I was saying. Like if
I'm
someone wants to be passionate about something and wants to be skillful, it isn't today, I don't think you stop them. I don't think you say, no, you're not passionate about it today. No, you're not skilled. I think what you say is, well, what does it take to develop that passion? What does it take to develop that skill? So I think I would definitely, but I think that here's where we don't serve people well. We don't serve people well when we're not honest about what they have to be passionate about or skilled at to get the things they say they want, and then encouraging them to spend resources to move down a path that could be that you can see is going to be a failure before you start, not because like of a self-limiting belief, but because someone doesn't actually want the thing. Like we could give them that information and say like, like this.
Agreed. Agreed, but I don't think that was clear from the conversation you guys are having. Like you guys both approach things from a very practical, this is how it is. And sometimes I do that too, right? I tend to be a little more of a dreamer than you guys, but I think that we have to be really careful. To me, the most important thing is figuring out what their dreams are and where they really can make an impact and what's going to ultimately make them happy. To me, that trumps everything else. And yes, you have to be practical. You have to have a plan. It's got to be executable. It's got to be a real plan. But
There's no problem with dreaming. Like I would say that if someone can dream, they know what their calling is in the middle, then this exercise might not even be useful to them. Which by the way, just because someone has a tool, you know me, I don't believe people should use tools just because they have them. Like that's a waste of energy. So if someone's like, hey, I am wired to do this thing, and they just know it at the core of their being, high five, good on you. Go get after it.
I don't think I'm not arguing with you, by the way. I don't think I'm not trying to attack the position or argue with you. Like, I think the tool, by the way, can help them find their dreams. I think the tool's good. I think the whole conversation, I just think that, back to the girl with the engineer or the marketing, right? What does she really want? And I think the conversation you had is very relevant. And maybe neither one of those are her dream, but it's so where I think you're hitting the nail right on the head is here's what you have to do. It's going to take this amount of work. Here's what the job really is. I think having that honest, real conversation is great. I just think it's important to identify the path that's going to make her happy ultimately, and then figure out how to execute that.
Well, I'm going to be a little bit pedantic here. I don't think it's important to tell her what she needs to do to be successful at marketing. I think she needs to hear like, hey, here are the paths in marketing. Here's what each of them take. If you want to take one of those, just know that these are the paths that exist in marketing today, right? There might be new ones that exist going forward. So this is what the world looks like today in marketing, right? And then make sure that like for me, I'm not a chemical engineer, right? So what I would do is I would go help her find someone who's 20 years into their chemical engineering career and share with her what the different courses in chemical engineering might look like from a career perspective, and just giving insight. Like what I tell people my role is when I'm counseling through this, my role is to show them the landscape so they can see it clearly and then make educated decisions. I don't want to have a dog in terms of what the is. I just want to make sure they can clearly see the landscape as it's laid out. And if there's some person that knows part of the landscape they don't, helping them find that person so they can get that. And the problem is that lots of people will only look at the landscape through their lens and say, because I did it, you should do it. Because I did it, you should do it. And so if we can teach people to be the voice of, here's the way I did it, but there's other ways too. Like that's where I wish the conversation would change a little bit. But we don't have as much of that today as we had even 15 years ago.
Yeah, it just shows that being a sage is a work in process, because I missed that completely. That's a great idea. I'm gonna follow up on that.
And Anthony, having two kids that are in college right now and watching this process, it saddens me when I watch the decisions. I think too many kids are making decisions for the wrong reasons. Instead of following what they really want to do, they're doing it because this is what my parents expect. This is what society expects. This is what my friends are doing. I think most kids are making decisions based on that more than actually figuring out what they want to do. Now I get it, because I went to school to be an engineering major for pretty much that reason, right? Had zero desire to be an engineer and went through those classes, had zero, after 3 years figured out I don't want to do this. So I understand, but I do think more kids ought to follow their dreams. And like I tell my kids, just try things. just go try a little bit of everything and figure out what it is you should be doing or you do like, which I think helps answer those 4 questions.
So, we've kind of gone back to like the early part of the career where someone's going through school or post high school, whatever. I wrote a letter to both of my kids who are older than 18. I'll write the same type of letter to my youngest when he turns 18. And what I write in this letter when they turn 18 years old is the same thing. I talk to them about how to make decisions. And one of the reasons I had this is because one of my kids asked me about a big decision. I think it was like, who did you vote for in an election? Or why did I choose Christianity? Or how do I make decisions about, spending large amounts of money? And what I tell them is, I'm not going to give you the answer about what you should think when you're 18. Instead, I'm going to tell you how I got to my decision. And I walk them through decision making, and I ask them to make important decisions in their life in the same way. And then I tell them when they're 18, the 3 most important decisions that they make in their life from my perspective. And those are really simple. It's who you spend your time with. And that generally means your spouse, if you're going to get married, and the 5 friends you're going to be closest to during the different phases of your life. It's what you choose to work on as a profession. And then it's what you believe in that's bigger than yourself. And then I go on and I finish the letter by talking about gratitude and resilience as important things to learn as a young adult. And so, but my older son, I saw him keep this letter on his desk for months and months and months, and he read it over and over again. And it's been a helpful part of our relationship in mentoring a young man as he is coming of age. And so I think, choosing those paths, it's about getting him ready to be the warrior, right? And letting him know that he doesn't have to understand the prince or the later career. And when he tells me, like, I don't know what I want to study in college, my answer was like, hey man, that is totally fine. I changed majors. I want you to learn how to learn. So go learn how to be a lifelong learner, learn how to ask questions, learn how to think critically. That's the most important thing. And then build your group of friends while you're in college and learn how to make good decisions socially and academically. Those are the things I want you learning. And so I think that's how you help someone prepare for these 4 phases. And that's how you help someone get into those 4 questions about, what am I built for?
That's great. By the way, for listeners, I want to remind talesofabundance.com. There's tools, the 4 questions, and all the stuff we've been talking about. You can go on there and download that stuff for free. So join that community and check it out. Let's move into, John, developing your career. And you want to kick us off with this? Tell us a little bit about developing your career and the different phases and things they can do.
Yeah, I think, when people are developing their career, I think you can manage your career by developing skill sets. And I encourage people to think about, like, what skill sets are you going to need for the next 3 years, the next 5 years, and how to start learning those skill sets now. And the more unsure that somebody is, the shorter that timeline can be, right? So, like, you can say, what skills do I want to develop in the next 30 days, for example? But if you're really clear about what you want, you can say, what skill sets do I want to develop in the next 10 years? So for me, I decided that when I retired, I wanted to teach part-time at a university. And so, I decided that I wanted to teach at the graduate level. That meant that I needed to have a certain level of education. And then I also wanted to be able to help people clinically. And so those are the 2 things that I've gone to do to make sure that I'm ready for that, in my 60s and into my 70s. And so I think, as we look at the performance of developing your career, I think there's some fundamental skills early in your career that have to be developed. And that's about responsibility and accountability. In other words, being able to do what you say you're going to do and accomplish tasks for other people on time and on budget. And that's an early part of anybody's careers. They've got to learn responsibility and accountability as the basis for long-term career success. And then there's a set of individual things you have to do and a set of relational things you have to do. So on the individual side, you have to be able to work as hard as you need to work to get what you want. You've got to be able to develop a professional skill set, whatever your profession is. You've got to have a belief system that helps you to get your job done. For example, not thinking you can't do it every day. And then you have to be able to prioritize your work, because there always will be more work than there is time. Like, it doesn't matter who you are, what company you're with, there's always more work than there is resource. And so learning how to prioritize is really important. So so you have kind of the ground you're standing on is responsibility and accountability. Then one side of the coin is work effort, skill set, mindset, and prioritization. On the flip side of the coin, you have relationships. So how to be accepting of other people in your professional environment, how to be appropriately professionally vulnerable about when you need help and things like that, how to maintain confidence and trust so you can, not share gossip and those kinds of things. And then how to see people in their best light so that you can work well together with people. And then you can get into things like, how many skills do you need, and how, like, I have people that have come to me and said, look, I want to be the CEO of a company in 10 years, and how do I develop into that? And so we put together a plan for someone to get to that level. And we've talked about mentorship and all those things. But I think as you look at your career, you start with the fundamentals: responsibility, accountability. Then you start with the things you can control and making sure you get professional relationships done well. That's where I think people should start.
Right. Anthony, how would you sum up your journey, or any, like, thinking back, what wisdom would you have for listeners and kind of big lessons learned along the way?
I guess the biggest lesson I learned was at many points along the way, I did not give enough thought to the impact I was having on my family and friends as I was singularly focused on career growth and moving to the next level. And it's resulted in significant disruption, and in some ways pain to those that I love the most. So I was very, very focused on the career, thinking that chasing position and an increased economic environment, that was my purpose. And later in life, I found out that that was not my purpose, and but the damage had been done. So that's probably the biggest thing, is that you've got to widen your view of the world and include anyone that's impacted, and that holds true inside of the work that you're doing inside the organization that you're in. The decisions you make in terms of how you run your department, your team, your business, those decisions don't affect just you; those affect the people around you, and it's really the difference between being a boss and being a servant leader. A servant leader is someone that has empathy, listens to people around them. You have a self-awareness. There's some foresight involved there, and it's a commitment to the growth of the team and people around you. In this case, both as a dad, that commitment to help your children grow, as well as the people on your team. So if people focused on that as a goal, I think it would be very, very helpful in helping them make decisions.
Fantastic. Thank you. Great. John, same question, just trying to repeat it, just wisdom or lessons learned along the way, maybe even things you wish you'd done different, but what would you tell people that, on this path, that might help people out that are listening?
I'm really glad Anthony got a chance to answer first, because first, I love what he said, and I think I've had similar experiences, but it also gave me a chance to reflect on this conversation. And I think the thing that hasn't come out as clearly as I would have liked it to have come out was that, there was a period of my life where I objectified people, and it was, people said that if you help other people get what they want, you'll get what you want. And I took that to mean, how do I get what I want from every transaction, every single thing? And, and that was a mistake. And so, I learned that, perfect balance at all moments in life isn't attainable, but over a long period of time, you can be balanced. And sometimes that means you have to dive in one place or dive in another. And I think less about what's in it for me than I did earlier in my career. I'm not going to say that I never do. That's not true. It's not real. But I try to, as best I can, give back to other people and have a broader view and see the bigger picture, and be in it for something bigger than myself. Now, for me, that's my faith. I think other people have other ways of kind of it being bigger than themselves, and I think that that's healthy to, whether it's a charitable cause or a community, but relationships are, foundational. And so I would hope that people would see this as a way of being self-reflective and improving themselves in career development, so that they can show up to those relationships that are important to them personally and professionally. And I find that the more I develop myself, the more I have to offer and give of myself. And that's been, the greatest lesson and part of what I've done. It's been such a more joyful experience to be thinking about ways to give to others versus how do I maximize this transaction for myself, which I've certainly been guilty of throughout parts of my career. And I'm sure that I'm guilty of that occasionally now too. Or maybe more than occasionally, you'd tell me.
Right. I want to circle back. I think one final question before we wrap things up. Both of you mentioned mentorship, and we kind of went different places and didn't dig as deep as I would have liked to have there. So how do you find mentors? Because I don't think this is obvious to everybody. I think there's people out there, they would love to have a mentor, but they don't know how to do it. So I would like to spend a couple minutes on that. Anthony, you want to go first? Just how you identify mentors, and maybe even how do you reach out to them?
Boy, it was very different. My understanding of today's businesses based on, where my son and daughters have been, it's very different. There were formal mentor programs when I was in corporate America, but I also befriended a number of senior people in the organization. Back in those days, it was okay to go to join a basketball team, if you will, where we would play basketball on weekends, and members of the company would be there. I'm not sure those things happen anymore. And from those relationships, you built friendships, and then you could, just start talking to them about, things relative to the business, the family, and things like that. So I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask, but the advice I would give anybody is network and be friendly and be conversant in a number of subjects to develop relationships, and then go seek and find people whose wisdom you would trust, and you would take their advice seriously if given.
Well, and you're working for SCORE now, right? Like that's a resource that, this is part of your SAGE phase. Right. Is you have become a mentor for people. Sure. Right? So how would, not necessarily SCORE, but if somebody were to approach you and wanted your wisdom and your SAGE advice, what should they do? What shouldn't they do?
Can I jump in here for a second? Because I wrote a topic on this for medical students for a medical education company. And I think that generally there's formal mentorship, which companies do have to bring somebody into a culture. And those are generally very short-lived mentorships to indoctrinate somebody into a culture, very normal organizationally. I think what we're talking about here is a more organic type of mentorship that you're asking about. Those generally work most effectively when the mentor taps the mentee. And so I think my guidance would be put yourself in a position where you can be tapped. And that usually happens by mentoring other people. And so if you're young and you want to mentor people, it's totally appropriate to mentor someone 10 years behind you. And so if you're in, college or just graduated early in your career, like Big Brothers Big Sisters has a really great formal program that teaches people how to mentor younger kids, and it gets you into that process. and it then exposes you to people who are then looking for young adults to mentor in their career. And so it puts you in a position where you can be tapped by someone who's looking to mentor someone in those spaces. And so I'd say, don't start by looking for a mentor, start by looking for who you can mentor, and look for someone 10 years behind you on the path, and then be aware of people 10 years ahead of you on the path. Like, it doesn't have to be someone who's 70 if you're 30, it can be someone who's 40 if you're 30. And so, and just, you know, like Anthony said, network, take people to coffee, be available, but start by giving. Start by going out there and finding places to do that. Again, I think if you're a part of a church, there's lots of like religious education programs and Sunday school. I think if you're not doing part of that, Big Brothers Big Sisters is a really great thing. There's lots of community centers out there. I'm sure we're going to get blown up with other people who are like, what about mine? What about mine? So check back with our community, and we'll make lists of places that you can go mentor people and give your time and talent. And then if you are someone who has the capacity, try to tap, 2 or 3 people to mentor. I called a kid who's a 30-year-old man, not a kid, but I called someone recently who I was in part of a conversation with, and it seemed like maybe they could use some mentoring where I might have some useful guidance. And I called them and said, hey, look, I try to mentor 3 people at a time. I don't have 3 right now on my calendar, and wondered if you'd be interested. And then, here's what it looks like. And then I'll send him a document, a little 1-page document you can download at talesofabundance.com about what mentorship looks like. And it's not like a formal, like, here's everything you have to do. It just gives people some thoughts about, like, here are some things you could do. It's very loose. Mentorship is about people who don't have a dog in the hunt. And so I think we should do a whole episode on mentorship. I think it's a great topic. It's a great question. I think we should dive deep into it.
Definitely. In couple of things, John, I want you just to hit on, and we could certainly hit on that in another topic. I think that's a great idea. But I know in conversations we've had, one of the things you're able to do is compartmentalize, and you have mentors in different phases, right? You've got business mentors, you've got financial mentors, you've got spiritual mentors. So I'd like you to address that. And the other thing that you're phenomenal at, I know Anthony and I have at times picked on you for this, but it's really a skill that you're really phenomenal at, is you are able to look and say, these are the best practices. And while that might not be a direct mentor, you're able to look at somebody that's had success doing something. So and then take that and apply it to the situation. So do you briefly want to hit on both those things?
Yeah, and I think I'm going to leave a little cliffhanger too, to come back and listen to more. I think that it's important to have different types of mentorship at each one of the phases we've talked about today: warrior, prince, king, and sage. And sometimes those are the same mentors who stay ahead of you throughout the entire journey. Sometimes there are different mentors that come and go throughout different phases. And some of those mentors help you through things like the 4 questions, like Anthony talked about with our chemical engineer example today. And sometimes there are people that are very specific about parts of your life. Like, I've got a mentor that helps me, with just my prayer life, and he's someone I trust implicitly around that. And so I think as we talk about mentorship and we talk about frameworks, it's, you don't have to recreate the wheel. You can talk to people, mentors, people that you work with, advisors that can give you those frameworks. And in the perfect environment, someone understands something about their own bias and at least calls it out and lets you know there might be other ways of thinking about that. I try to be clear that, like, my framework isn't the only framework. It's a framework, or it's the best one I've found. Or in a few cases, I've looked at most of the frameworks that are available, and this is the best practice, and here's why. And I try to be clear about which place I'm coming from, so that as people navigate the 4 seasons of their career, that when they come into contact with me, I'm helping them propel forward on their path versus giving them friction or taking them onto my path or onto some other path. That's the way I try to think about it.
Great. Well, Anthony, John, thanks. I think this has been a great conversation. To our listeners, a few times we've referenced a lot of different tools today. You can get those at talesofabundance.com. Interact with the community. If you like this, please subscribe on iTunes or wherever you happen to listen. And look, I just hope that everybody listening got nuggets and things that they can take on their search for abundance and bringing abundance to the world.